Welcome everybody to a new webinar organized by the Institute for European Policy Making. The YEP, as we call it, was inspired by Mario Monti, and it is hosted by Bocconi University with the mission to combine the analytical rigor of a research institute and the policy impact of a think tank. My name is Stefano Feltri. I'm a journalist working with the Institute to support editorial and outreach activities. Before going to today's discussion, let me remind you to subscribe the YEP at BU monthly newsletter to receive regular updates about our events and publication. You can find the newsletter on our website. If you are interested, next week on November 30th, we are hosting a webinar about Italian government economic policy and the 2024 budget law with Lorenzo Binismaghi and Silvia Merler, among others. And today, I have the opportunity to introduce and moderate a conversation about the incoming COP28, the UN Conference of Parties on Climate and Environment, that is about to begin in 10 days. We will discuss what is at stake at the conference with a particular focus on two key points on the agenda, loss and damage and climate finance. We have two very distinguished speakers. So we have Barbara Buchner. She is a Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative, which is an analyst and advisory organization focused on finance and policy. And Barbara co-authored with her colleagues the recent 2023 edition of the Global Landscape on Climate Finance, and she will talk about it. Elisa Cagliari is a research scholar at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis and at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and she will focus on the state of the art of the negotiations on loss and damage. After the presentations, Valentina Bosetti will kick off the Q&A part of the webinar with her comments and questions. And Valentina is a professor at Bocconi University teaching environmental and climate change economics. And she's also a member of the managing board of the Institute for European Policy Making, and she supervises all YEP's initiative on climate and environmental policies. Last but not least, you can write comments in the chat. And if you want to ask a question, you can raise your digital hand in Teams. Please remember that the event is on the record and the recording will be published on YEP website and on YouTube channel once it's over. Okay, so Barbara, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a true pleasure. So thank you, Stefano, and thank you, Valentina, for inviting me to this discussion today. Again, I think what I'd like to do today is to first give you an overview of this latest report that Stefano, that you have mentioned, and then really kind of engage in a discussion with all of you, also the implications of that report as we are going towards COP28, the next negotiations, but also broader as we are trying to see how we can scale investments into climate action, sustainable development. Again, as you said, Stefano, my name is Barbara Buchner. I'm the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative. And if you're not familiar with CPI, we are an analysis and advisory organization with deep expertise in finance and in policy. What we do is we work with governments, with finance institutions, and with businesses to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we have 6 offices around the world in Brazil, India, Indonesia, and the US and the UK, and a growing presence in Africa. But what I always love to mention is that we were actually born also out of Venice in Italy. So just to get started here, yes, I think I'm here at the great, but also at a very busy time as we launched the 2023 edition of our Global Landscape of Climate Finance report a couple of weeks ago and are heading into COP28. I think what I will share with you today is that there's good news and bad news. We did hit the first trillion milestone in climate finance. However, our estimated needs are about 5 times higher. And in the meantime, 2023 has been a year where the world broke all-time heat records. And as you all know, climate change is not in the future anymore. It's here, and it clearly is now. So I'll soon walk you through our findings, which indicate the urgent need to work towards mobilizing finance in regions where capital is lacking, as well as sectors where the progress is lacking to really meet our global and our collective climate targets. Just as some more background information, the landscape has the most comprehensive information available about the scale, key actors, instruments, recipients, and users of finance supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation in the years of 2021 and 2022. We did start this work on the climate finance landscape back in 2010. And now we have over a decade of experience in tracking climate finance. And at CPI, we hope that by providing decision makers with robust and comprehensive information on progress against real climate investment needs, we will help them prioritize action and act ambitious policies. And that obviously does link to COP28 and the negotiations. Previous editions of our report have served as the basis of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the report, the chapter on climate finance, but also as the UNFCCC's biennial assessment and the overview of climate finance flows, and as background for both G7 and G20 statements. So this year we have made several innovations, which we try to do every time, and we kind of come up with our new reports. And these innovations this year include new data on climate finance flows that particularly lacked information such as energy efficiency, such as AFOLU, which is agriculture and forestry, and other land use and water. I also include bolstering investment need estimates and new analysis on costs of inaction, as well as further breakdown of finance into emerging markets and developing economies, as well as least developed countries. And I think that will be nicely also connecting to some of Elisa's discussions later on. So now let me walk you through our key findings. Again, as I briefly already anticipated, we have a new milestone. Average annual climate finance flows reached almost 1.3 trillion US dollars most recently, which means it nearly doubled compared to 4 years ago. And this obviously is a large uptick. It was primarily driven by a significant acceleration in mitigation finance by around $440 billion annual average in 2019 and 2020. But the remainder of the growth also stems from methodological improvements and from new data sources, resulting in additional finance flows of a little more than 107 billion US dollars. But also in want just to make the point here that the improved data on climate finance is also good news. It's something we've been pushing at CPI since the very beginning to really get a better understanding of where we stand and where we need to go. A quick clarification just on what we track and what we don't track. Our analysis covers new annual primary finance flows into climate action, so both mitigation and adaptation interventions. And that means that we really focus on real economy change on the ground, climate investment at the project level, like building renewable power plants or building adaptive capacity of a local community. So what we don't do is we don't track transfers of funds in the financial market that don't yet result in real economy activities. We do take very much care in our methodology to aim for non-double counted numbers. And if you're interested, we have a separate methodological document where we really outline all the different definitions and the data sources and the ways we deal with different issues as we're tracking all the data here. On our next slide, you can see that while the increase of finance is clearly great news, we obviously know that there is still a significant gap between the current flows and what's needed for low carbon and climate resilient development. And this graph here depicts a reality check basically on where we should be headed. What we see is that at least 5.9 trillion US dollars in annual investment is required by 2030 if we want to keep our goals in reach. And that the ranges of estimates of needs here that you can see here are based on publicly available data and scenarios across different sectors, such as energy, such as agriculture, industry, adaptation, and others. And those are all from reputable organizations. And to clarify, obviously, climate finance needs is not an exact science, but the real needs will depend on decisions we take today and hopefully in 10 days at COP28, but also at the growth that we will see. So the decarbonization trajectories different countries will be using. So depending on sector or region, the needs are very heterogeneous. So on the next slide, let's put the $1 trillion, which is always a little abstract if you hear about those that are required, in perspective. So what do these trillions of dollars actually mean, and how do they compare to other things we spend money on? And I think this graph here, this is pretty, has a pretty big meaning. I think what we can see is that the 1.3 trillion in climate investment that we tracked is about only 1% of global GDP today. And in 2022, the public sector alone spent twice the size of climate finance on military, and they spent over $1 trillion in direct subsidies to fossil fuels, and also end up spending an additional 5 to 6 trillion in implicit subsidies. So the question is not only how to get more climate investments, but also how to shift existing investments away from high carbon users. Achieving a resilient and just net zero world will really require all public and private actors to align our finances with international climate goals that are agreed in the Paris Agreement. So the next slide here, I think what we also found is that delaying climate action and failing to keep the world on a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory will result in significantly higher costs down the line. I think this is a point that we need to make much stronger. What we see is that climate change impacts, such as increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, more frequent extreme weather events, they will result in labor losses, they will result in reduced agricultural yields and in decreased global tourism, as well as damages to assets, to capital, to productive land. So rising temperatures and worsening air quality will also increase rates of mortality, of climate-related illness, and of overall healthcare spending. And what we found is that various studies suggested under current policies, warming will exceed 3 degrees Celsius, and that will lead to macroeconomic losses of at least 18% GDP by 2050. And some studies says up to 20% by 2100. I mean, these are huge numbers. Again, I think we need just to be much clearer in what we're dealing with. But at the same time, I think while these really are huge numbers, they are likely to be dramatic underestimates since they fail to capture costs related to biodiversity loss, to stranded assets, and to broader social issues. So I think overall, the projected social and economic costs of a warming world will far outstrip those of transition. And the cost of inaction will rise the longer we delay, and that's certainly something we have observed over the last decades. The figures on the screen here just show increasing climate investments to the levels needed by 2015, and they will lead to considerable reduction in social economic losses by 2100. So in other words, I think what the main message I'd like you to take away from this slide is that sticking to a business as usual world would create more than double the losses of a 1.5 degree Celsius scenario. So let's get back to the landscape now and show you our famous, again, born in Italy, a spaghetti graph, as I call it. So what do we exactly track in the landscape in this Sankey diagram? I think the diagram provides a snapshot of climate finance flows through the life cycle. So as you can see on the left-hand side, capital sources and intermediaries that are categorized into public and private, which are further broken down by categories such as commercial financial institutions or corporations, but also government actors or multilateral climate funds and development finance institutions, etc. Next, we see the instruments used to raise finance, such as debt and equity. We also include grants, and then every financial flow is broken down into mitigation, in adaptation, and dual benefits. And dual benefits projects target both mitigation and adaptation objectives. And finally, on the right-hand side, the Sankey concludes in the economic sectors where the finance is spent, such as renewable energy, transport, and agriculture and land use. So let's go a little bit deeper into our findings now and look at the public and private finance sources in more details. I think the overall share of tracked climate finance provided by public sources are now slightly more than half of the total. So mobilizing private finance at scale is really important in the years ahead, given limited public budgets and affected public finance will remain to be scarce. And I hope that we'll get a little bit into the discussion of these issues later on. Just to highlight the importance of development finance institutions, they continued to provide the majority of public finance, both the national ones, but also multilateral ones and bilateral ones, but then followed also by state-owned entities and government expenditure. Moving on to the private finance, private actors provided around $625 billion per year during this 2-year period that we are looking at the moment. And it's particular commercial financial institutions, corporations, and households that are the largest investors, as these are actors that are directly engaging with real economy activities. So let me go a little bit deeper into the results around mitigation finance. As you can see on this slide here, mitigation continues to attract almost all climate finance receiving. In fact, it's more than 90% of the total, and leaving adaptation and dual benefit projects far behind. I think the point here I want to really stress is that mitigation projects in energy and transport sector alone were responsible for 2/3 of annual climate finance flows in 2021-2022. And mitigation also seems to be attracting virtually all climate finance coming from the private sector, which you can see here in orange on this graph, while adaptation and to a lesser extent also dual benefits projects remain a prerogative of the public sector. Just in terms of numbers, again, specifically 2021-2022 annual mitigation finance reached about $1.2 trillion and has been growing 60% compared to the previous 2 years. And this is an all-time high growth for mitigation finance, one that really drove the major increase that we have observed in total climate finance flows. And this increase was largely driven by high investments in renewable energy and in electric vehicles in East Asia, in Europe, and in Latin America. On this slide here, you can see, in fact, that the growth has not been consistent across mitigation sectors. Again, energy and sector and transport continue to attract the majority of mitigation flows. And within the energy sector, renewables energy attracted actually 97% of finance. And with solar PV, particularly and onshore wind, that have been dominating the sector for quite some time now. And I think these two markets have really undergone exponential growth in recent years, particularly thanks to continued declines in technology costs, but also because of strong policy support across the world. I think still sadly, I think again another factor I really want to highlight that despite the need for a swift transition of the global energy system, the annual investments in new renewable assets are still only half the investments made in new fossil fuel assets. So much more needs to be done in this sector to shift policy support and capital away from fossil fuels and towards renewables and other energy transition solutions and technologies. Just very quickly, I do realize I'm going a little long here. Second to energy, the energy sector, transport received almost a third. It's around 29% of annual mitigation finance. Again, it's an all-time high in 2021-22, and that's particularly due to exponential growth in electric vehicle sales, which has been led by China, but also Western Europe and the US, and certainly a trend that we've observed over the last years that many of these EV markets have matured and become much more competitive with some of the internal combustion engine alternatives, especially for cars. Let me just go to the next slide here, because I think what is important also to highlight is, although mitigation attracts the majority climate finance, the investment gap to avoid the worst impacts of climate change remains huge. What you see here on this chart is a comparison of mitigation finance flows in green with mitigation finance needs in yellow and the mitigation potential, which is on the secondary axis. And what we see here is that while mitigation finance reached this new record of almost 1.2 trillion, annual flows actually need to reach much more. They need to reach around 8.4 trillion per year between now and 2030, which is about 7 times higher than current investments, and need to further raise after that time even more. However, I think what I also want to highlight here is that in relative terms, the most significant gaps that we see are in the FLU and industry sectors, where funding needs really do increase by more than 180 and 136 times respectively compared to current levels. And I think underfunding, particularly in the FLU sector, is concerning, given that this sector is estimated to have the largest mitigation potential, and yet still receives minimal finance when it comes to mitigation. So again, I think there's a lot of call for action and that I'd like to highlight here. Just very briefly on the next slide, you can see the types of financial instruments that are being used. You can see that mitigation flows were dispersed through a broader range of financial instruments compared to adaptation and dual benefits project, and that is due to a wider variety of investors that are involved, both from the private but also from the public sector, which all have different mandates and all have different risk return profiles. I think I'll only highlight the one point that I think is very important if you think about further mobilizing capital, which is that concessional finance, which includes low-cost debt in light purple and grants in blue, accounted for less than 10%. Not surprisingly, this share is much lower for mitigation finance than for adaptation and dual benefits finance, where returns are generally not as high, and the landscape is made up mainly of public investors, and especially these sectors to which we will now turn. I think concessional finance really plays a key role in unlocking further capital and is really crucial for managing risks and uncertainties related to emerging technologies and markets. So on the next slide, let's now go into adaptation finance. I know you'll hear more from Elisa about loss and damage. It's important to emphasize that what we're talking about here is a little bit different, as we're still missing some clarity and definitions. But this slide here basically shows you that adaptation finance reached a little over $63 billion in 21-22, which is a record high in absolute terms. However, it's a more modest growth rate than was observed compared with the last landscape report, and adaptation accounts for only 5% of the global total overall, which I think is a key message I'd like you to take away here. I think the other message is that tracked adaptation finance remains dominated by public actors who contributed 98% of the total, with, again, development finance institutions providing most of the funding. And I think this reflects a genuine drive by these public institutions to avoid or minimize the adverse impact of climate change, but also the issues we face with monitoring adaptation finance but also from the private sector, as well as issues related to demonstrating a real business case for adaptation investments. On the next slide, you just can see in this bar chart here that we estimate that developing countries alone need around a little over $210 billion per year in adaptation finance up to 2030, and almost 240 billion between 31 and 2050. So adaptation finance needs to approximately 3.5 times, needs to be approximately 3.5 times higher than the tracked global total for developing countries alone. I think, again, a big message here, and certainly important for the COP negotiations in Dubai. It is important when looking at global adaptation finance to differentiate between what funding is sourced and committed domestically within countries and what's also sourced and committed internationally. What you can see here is that overall adaptation finance, it's a little bit more even split between domestic and international flows, if you compare it particularly to mitigation finance. But if you look at the regional breakdowns, as you can see in this figure here, it indicates the variability within the figures. I think most domestic adaptation finance is for countries in East Asia and Pacific, with an emphasis on China. But if you filter by the international funding, only Sub-Saharan Africa is the largest recipient, receiving almost a third of international total. But let me go back and get towards my final slides, just to come to the global picture of all tracked climate finance again, and just look at the geographic distributions of the flows. So on this slide here, you can see that East Asia and Pacific continues to dominate. It's actually almost $560 billion that are concentrated in this region, followed by Western Europe and the US and Canada. And together, these three regions account for 84% of total global climate finance. You can also see here the public-private splits per regions, which can vary substantially. For example, if you just look at the relative dominance of private capital in the US and Canada, compared to the importance of public funding, again, in sub-Saharan Africa. This year, we also categorized countries according to economic development status, and differentiating between developing economies, emerging market, and developing economies, or MDs, and the least developed countries, LDCs. And here we find that just over 2% of global climate finance flows flowed to or within LDCs, while 14% flow to or within emerging market and developing economies, excluding China. So I think, again, the point here is that in many cases, we're seeing an imbalance between climate change vulnerability and the destination of climate finance, with some of the most vulnerable countries who are disproportionately at risk from climate change receiving only very little, if not minimal, finance here. So now on to my final slide, recommendations. We identified 4 buckets of recommendations to really enable a paradigm shift in finance. I think the first one is around transforming the financial system across both public and private finance. I think here reforming international financial institutions is gaining a lot of traction because they are uniquely positioned to take more risks, to channel more innovative finance, but also to leverage concessional finance to expand private flows. And from the private sector side, strengthening net zero integrity really is crucial. And we saw increased private sector net zero commitments, but these are yet clearly to translate into meaningful changes in private capital flows towards climate solutions and, again, away from harmful activities. The second recommendation is really to focus on bridging climate and development needs. I think harnessing the synergies between development and climate action makes sense, because climate change and development agendas are strongly interconnected, and they can deliver co-benefits for nature, for public health, for energy access, for energy more generally, energy security and water security, but also for food systems, reliability, gender equality, amongst many other areas. In addition to targeted interventions to reduce the impacts of physical climate risk, such as, for example, improving sustainable building codes or establishing early warning weather system, it's also necessary to integrate and mainstream adaptation activities across all financial systems. And further, I think, as I've also tried to highlight throughout my talk, data continues to reveal that fossil fuels are deeply embedded in economies and communities. So pathways for ending fossil fuel extraction and consumption must account for the impacts on all key stakeholders on all levels, from national to local, and this obviously includes workers and communities, public and private employers, but also governments and financial institutions across the public and private parts of the ecosystem. Third point, very important, is about mobilizing domestic capital. I think we all know we need to align the national development contributions with the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios. The current NDCs are still significantly misaligned with the goals set in the Paris Agreement. So we need to really work on those, but we also need to improve the local ecosystem for climate investment. Again, our work shows that the majority of climate finance is raised and distributed domestically, and I think this shows just how important it is to further mobilize domestic capital. The fourth and last point here, and this is something we've been trying to stress since the very beginning when we started our tracking work, is the need to act to improve data. High quality climate finance data is crucial for understanding investment gaps, for building effective solutions, for informing investors and measuring collective progress. So while we have seen progress in advancing data efforts for more than a decade now, we continue to see pervasive data gaps across actors and sectors. It's not easy to put together all the data that we presented to you in this landscape report, because they're still not standardized. They have various different definitions. And frankly, nobody has any obligation to report on climate finance, including domestic public budgets, private finance, which all is not ideal. With that, apologies for running late. It's a huge effort to put together all this data and bring these different data sources together. And what we really want to do with that is really help inform discussions and inform decision making. So very much look forward to the discussions after Lisa's talk. And back to you, Stefano.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for such an impressive work. I mean, I think it would be interesting in the Q&A session to understand whether it is possible or not to fill that investment gap, which is, quite impressive. So I think that is the second part of the discussion. But first of all, Elisa, now it's up to you to explain us what loss and damage is, and if and how we should worry about it as much as we have to worry about climate finance.
Well, for sure, in short. But thanks, Stefano, for the introduction, and thanks also, Barbara, for your excellent presentation. I think you made a really good job in showing what's happening on the ground in the real economy with respect to mitigation and adaptation finance. My job today is to take participants to a very different space, which is that of climate negotiations. And as Stefano said, I will focus on particular on the issue of loss and damage funding, which was one of the key issues to be discussed at COP27 last year, and which resulted in the establishment of new funding arrangements, including a fund on loss and damage, and will also be one of the key topics for the upcoming COP in Dubai. So also as a transition to Barbara's talk, I will briefly discuss how climate finance is framed in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And I think this is also important to understand how the outcomes on loss and damage fit in this context. But I would then focus most of my talk, as you said, on the loss and damage fund and funding arrangements, which were agreed at COP27, the work of the Transitional Committee, which was set up to operationalize them during the course of 2023. And expectations for COP28. And I would like to mention that I had the opportunity to follow negotiations on loss and damage very closely as part of the Italian and EU delegation. And then I will conclude my talk by outlining very briefly the broader picture around finance at COP and some key issues to keep an eye on in Dubai. So, as Barbara outlined, climate finance encompasses local, national, transnational financing from public, private, and alternative sources that seek to support mitigation and adaptation action. In the context of the UNFCCC and the climate regime more in general, climate finance is mainly framed in terms of financial obligations. So the UNFCCC, by recalling the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, calls developed countries to provide finance to assist developing countries. And the Paris Agreement also reaffirms this obligation, while for the first time also encouraging voluntary contribution by other parties in position to do so. And to facilitate the provision of climate finance, the Convention established a financial mechanism. And here in this slide, you can see a bit how it works. And this financial mechanism should channel financial resources to the developing countries, and it serves both the Convention, the Paris Agreement, and also the Kyoto Protocol. And the financial mechanism entrusted, its operation is entrusted to the so-called operating entity. And here on the slide, for example, you can see the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, which are these operating entities, and the Fund on Loss and Damage, once it's operationalized, hopefully at COP28, will also be one of the operating entity of the financial mechanism, and will receive guidance from the COP and the CMA, which are the supreme governing body of the Convention and the Paris Agreement, respectively. The establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27 was a key milestone in a much longer journey, a journey that started more than 30 years ago. It was during the same drafting of the UNFCCC convention that small island states requested establishment of what they called an insurance mechanism, which at the end of the day was a compensation mechanism for compensating small island states for the irreversible losses from sea level rise they would have suffered as a result of the emissions from developed countries. This request didn't make it into the convention. It actually took 15 years for loss and damage to be formally recognized within the UNFCCC process, and even more for the establishment of a dedicated mechanism to deal with loss and damage, which was finally established in 2013 in Warsaw as the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is the main vehicle to deal with loss and damage under the UNFCCC. But also the Paris Agreement recognized the need to act on loss and damage in 2015 by dedicating a specific article on the issue, and so anchoring the topic within the same Paris Agreement. I would like to stress that despite this institutional advancement, there's no agreed definition of loss and damage in the climate regime, and this is mainly due to political sensitivities, especially the reference to compensation and liability, which was made since the beginning by developing countries. But there has been a progressive convergence around an understanding of what loss and damage is. And you can think about it as those residual impacts from climate change when mitigation and adaptation is not enough. And with respect to the drivers of loss and damage, this includes extreme events. So, for example, tropical cyclones, floods, droughts, but also slow onset events like sea level rise or increase in temperature. And these very severe impacts, which are under the label of loss and damage, can be both economic, so like losses in agricultural production or disruption of infrastructure, but also non-economic in nature. And here in the negotiation, the typical references are loss of biodiversity, ecosystem services, but also loss of life or loss of territory because of sea level rise, as well as loss of traditional and indigenous knowledge. The Paris Agreement also recognized the importance of responding to loss and damage, and the language which it used is that of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, where averting refers to mitigation efforts, so reducing the risk of loss and damage in the first place. Adaptation is about minimizing the impact, while addressing are the type of actions like, for example, emergency response, social protection, or relocation support that need to be put in place when a disaster strikes. The big question, which was raised by developing country in the past 10 years was, okay, how are we gonna fund the addressing part of the story? And COP27 resulted in a response to this request. As I was mentioning in the beginning, party decided to establish new funding arrangements for responding to loss and damage, including a focus on addressing loss and damage. And these new funding arrangements, which include a fund, should target the particularly vulnerable developing countries and should be able to identify and expand also the sources of funding needed to respond in this context. And parties also decided to establish a transitional committee with the task, the very difficult task, I would say, to operationalize the new funding arrangement by providing some recommendation to be adopted at COP28. The work of the Transitional Committee was very intense. It lasted for the whole year. They met 5 times. Here, the TC5, so the last meeting is in the slide in red because it was an emergency meeting, because parties were not able to come to an agreement when they were supposed to, so in October. But this gives you actually an idea of how difficult these negotiations were. The Transitional Committee also worked through thematic workshops, delving into specific aspects of the mandate. It also received technical support by the UNFCCC Secretariat and also political support, or at least political push, let's say, in a number of occasions, which were also mentioned by the decision adopted in Sharm, like the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, ministerial consultation, and the meetings of the International Financial Institutions principals during the Climate Ambition Summit. Even if it was very difficult, the committee, which was made of 24 representatives, 10 from developed countries, the EU had 4 seats, and 14 from developing countries, managed to draft a set of recommendations, which is expected to be adopted at COP28. And I will guide you through the top 3 issues of contentious that the parties had to solve, which related to who will benefit from the fund, who will put the money, and where the fund will be placed. Of course, the recommendations are much more detailed, and if you want, we can further discuss the details during the Q&A session. But starting from the first one, which was the question, who would receive money from the fund? Originally, at least in the COP27 decision, there was a reference to developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effect of climate change. If you read this sentence, at least the meaning for the layman person would be to identify somehow subgroups within developing countries that are more vulnerable than others to the impacts of climate change. But this understanding has never been really operationalized within the climate regime. So at the end of the day, this expression, at least in the loss and damage space, is used to target all developing countries. The intention from developed countries, so basically from the EU, but also the US, and here I put a tweet from our Irish member of the TC, was to have a fund prioritizing small island states and LDCs, and this would somehow respond also to the point made by Barbara that adaptation finance and even more loss and damage finance probably is not reaching who would need it the most. There was opposition by the G77 in China, who really wanted to avoid any differentiation within developing countries. And this point was particularly strong for Latin America. So in the end, the landing zone was found in maintaining eligibility for all developing countries, while demanding the board to elaborate an allocation system that could also take into consideration a minimum percentage allocation floor for LDCs and seeds, so to ensure that at least part of the money will be channeled through this group of vulnerable countries. But I would say that the most difficult part was to understand who's going to put money into the fund. If you recall the first slide that I showed, the financial mechanism under the Convention and the Paris Agreement is pretty rigid in defining who needs to provide finance and who are the recipients. Developed countries called for mobilizing a wider variety of sources, for example, the private sector or innovative finance, for example, debt swaps or the revenues for carbon taxes. But they also called for not only the usual suspects to provide finance, but to open the fund up also to contribution by other states. And you might imagine that developed countries had a couple of options in mind, for example, oil producing states. And here I put a quote that was made during the last meeting of the TC, when apparently when one Western official said to the Saudi representative that if you can pay millions to have Cristiano Ronaldo, then you can also pay into the fund. So this was kind of the very difficult conversation taking place with respect to the sources issue. Of course, G77 plus China wanted to stick to the obligations as enshrined in the Common but Differentiated Responsibility principle. The final compromise was to have language urging developing countries to continue to provide support while encouraging other parties to provide support for activities to address loss and damage. So the big novelty of this fund is that even if it will be part of the financial mechanism, even if it will be an operating entity of the financial mechanism, it will be a voluntary fund without the usual bifurcation between developed and developing countries, if things remain like this at COP28. This is the caveat. With respect to where the fund would be located, developed countries called for a fund to be hosted under the World Bank. And the rationale here was to have a fund really up and running in the shortest possible time, where the G77 plus China wanted it to be an independent standalone fund. But this would have required sometimes, if you think about the green climate funds, it took really years to be established. And the end of the day, again, a compromise was found in deciding to have a fund under the World Bank, but for an interim period of 4 years and subject to a number of conditions that the World Bank needs to meet, and including, for example, the possibility for communities to access small grants and providing access to countries that are not World Bank members, and so on. And maybe later on we can further unpack this issue of the lack of trust by developing countries towards the World Bank. So these are the key elements of the recommendations that should be adopted at COP28. The general feeling by parties, so by states, is to try to avoid reopening up negotiations, because this would mean opening up really a Pandora box. And here I just copied and pasted some declaration that have been made in the past week to show you this intention to politically lock the deal. For example, the COP presidency met the EU Commissioner for Climate Action, and they released a joint statement backing the results of the Transitional Committee. And also the Commissioner said that the EU was ready to announce substantial contributions to the fund, granted that we had ambitious outcomes of mitigation, adaptations, and means of implementation. So the subtext is, okay, if you don't reopen the negotiation, we're ready to put resources in this. And here you can also see the joint statement by China and the US, released only a couple of days ago, where these two countries, which are big players in the UNFCCC, welcome with appreciations the recommendation of the Transitional Committee. So this is for loss and damage at COP28. But I would like to conclude my talk with a couple of issues which I think it's important to keep an eye on at COP28 with respect to finance. The first is the one related to developed countries' goal to mobilize $100 billion per year in climate finance up to 2025, which is discussed under the agenda item on long-term finance. And here in Dubai, we are not expecting really discussion on substance, but parties will discuss the latest OECD data. And the good news is that it seems like the goal was finally met last year, and this is important also to reestablish trust among parties, because the fact of failing reaching this global goal since its establishment was not really helping the negotiations. Of course, after 2025, we're going to have a new quantified goal on climate finance. This will also be one point of discussion of COP25. And the issue here is how to devise the work, which has already started, the technical work towards the definition of the goal, which is expected for next year. And then this was the last point, relates to what Barbara was saying, to the spaghetti graph she was showing at the beginning. Adaptation finance is really lagging behind. This is recognized in the negotiations and as a point of discussion in the agenda, and a goal about doubling global levels of adaptation finance by 2025 compared to 2019. And this is a point of the agenda which was included by African states. And here at COP28, there will be discussion about a report prepared by the Standing Committee on Finance, which was mandated last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. If you want to know more about how these negotiations eventually unfolded, CMCC usually organizes a webinar after negotiations. It's going to be in Italian, unfortunately, but we'll kind of gonna take stock of what happened in COP28, so keep an eye on the website, and happy to further discuss this issue with you now and beyond COP28. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Elisa. I have to say that when I read how big is the fee that the World Bank is demanding to host the Loss and Damage Fund, I understood more why the developing countries are so skeptical about it. But maybe we will discuss this later on. And so now it's up to Valentina to share with us some comments and ask some questions. And then everybody is welcome to raise his or her hand and to write comments in the chat.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank you both. This was really, it really gives us a clear view what's going to happen, what has happened, and what is going to happen, or what to expect. So really thanks a lot for how clear you were. I have really a question for each of you, so that then we have time for others to ask questions. And I was intrigued by the fact that the first is for Barbara. I was intrigued by the fact that the AFOLU, which for people who are not in the business is agriculture, forest, and other land use, where we have most of the potential of mitigation, or a large fraction of the potential for mitigation and for generating negative emissions through, for example, afforestation, changes in the way we do agriculture, changes in the way we feed the cows, etc., to reduce methane. So there's a huge potential, very low marginal costs, but very, very little that is happening. And I wonder whether it's because of the lack of clear policies in that sector, which are going to come in Europe, for example, but they're still lacking, or is it for the difficulties in monitoring that kind of mitigation? So it's much harder, much easier to see that you moved from a coal power plant to a renewable power plant. It's much harder to track for the reduction in emission because of afforestation. And then I have a question to Elisa related to the fact that in some sense we're talking about things that are related one to the other. So the more you invest in adaptation, the less in principle, I mean, if everything were perfect, you would do all kind of adaptation measures, and then we'll have to do loss and damage. But if you don't invest in adaptation, which is what we're seeing, we're going to see much more loss and damage. So in one sense, if I am keen in getting a lot of funds for loss and damage, which basically is just a compensation measure and doesn't require an investment, maybe I can play the negotiation in a way that I make sure that no adaptation funds come, and I can then claim a much more loss and damage. So do you see that happening? Is there, is there something that you see in the conversations within the negotiations? And I leave it to you.
Great. No, excellent question, Valentina. And so I think it's a combination. I mean, we have been, certainly there are still issues around data, like tracking the data and really understanding how much money is flowing, and then turning those into specific solutions, particularly on the investment side. So coming up with a clear investment case for investors that have not been in this space yet that much. I mean, for example, we are running another initiative, which is Climate Shot Impact Investor Initiative, the CLIC, in a coalition where we are trying to actually highlight to particular private investors that there is a clear business case into some of the various sectors under this AFALU umbrella. But at the same time, I think particularly in emerging economies, we do not yet see the same kind of policy focus that you have mentioned, for example, in Europe, that is coming. So I think it's a combination of still data gaps as well, being able to monitor the data. So, both data gaps on the really how much money is going into these areas, but then also monitoring, as you said, the impacts of those investments. So really, how can you monitor some of the impacts there, and that then in turn kind of turning those into some clear recommendation for policies and also for investment vehicles that can really scale some of these parts. So I think it comes back to some of, one of the old issues, that some of the co-benefits are not very, rightly priced, that some of the externalities are not rightly priced, and this way are kind of not really kind of turning then into, the investment opportunities just not being taken up. Certainly an area where we hope to do more, but I think also, like from your end and others who are listening in, I think are certainly a call for action in this work, and we can put some more resources that are focused more on the agriculture and agri-food system side, where we see a lot of opportunities as well, and where we started doing more work. But let me stop.
Okay, thank you, Vale, for the very interesting question. And I would say that within negotiations, I don't see this kind of incentives to not to push on adaptation finance in order to have more loss and damage finance, which would be in a way maybe easier finance because it's compensatory. I don't see that, because the finance needs are so huge that developing countries are really trying to make the most from any single item under finance, being mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And then the second thing is that many times we think about developing countries as a homogeneous group, but the G77 plus China includes, very, very different countries, from, as I said, China to Pacific Island, Caribbean island, African states. And for example, the issue of loss and damage has been very dear to small island states in particular, and also LDCs, while other countries maybe have been more rapid in a way. And the same is true for adaptation finance. In adaptation finance, for example, African states are very vocal. So there's also this kind of dynamics to take into consideration.
Is there anybody else with a question? I might have one, but I don't want to take your place. We have very shy participants. No, I asked a question to Barbara, which I already mentioned before. So, I mean, the financial gap is so huge that maybe, I mean, one first reaction might be, okay, this is an impossible task to meet this goal. I mean, what is your reaction? I mean, are we on the right track? So the numbers that you showed at the beginning of your presentation show that with the right incentive and with the right motivation, we can close the gap? Or the main takeaway from your presentation is that maybe, I mean, it's too much. So maybe we just have to have a mindset in which we try to do our best, but we will never close that gap.
Great point. Well, I tell you, I mean, working on these issues since a long time because I'm an optimist. Otherwise, I would not be here. So I do know that we can close the gap, but it does require some specific changes, and particularly like in our financial system and in international financial architecture. Again, what we've seen, I think the positive trend is that we have seen more investments than ever going into this space. But it is 1% of global GDP. So, but you have seen how much money is in the system for other things. I think it is about shifting money away from these harmful investments towards, just creating the level playing field, basically, that allows us to use some of the capital that is in the financial system already, and the money is there, towards kind of more climate and sustainable development related activities. So it is going in the right direction. Again, if you look at the energy sector, for example, more generally, that's been a success story. Technology costs are down. You need to replicate that for other sectors. Coming back to Valentina's question as well, you need to come up with the right ways to making sure that the cost of technologies are going down in other sectors and are kind of, it gets attractive, but also the perceived risks of investments are lower. So it's very often, for example, at the moment, we don't see investments in emerging economies because investors still perceive or have face real risks in investing, macroeconomic risks that are not even necessarily related to climate action. So really kind of political certainty, having kind of a deep capital market, domestic capital market. So there needs to be a lot that happens to really kind of shift and transform the overarching financial system and architecture as clear next steps. And we talked about briefly, Lisa mentioned the World Bank as well. I think that the first step here is really kind of to look at the existing ecosystem and look how the money that is already in the system for climate action is actually being used. And that can be used much more effectively. Development finance institutions, MDBs, they can use the public money that they have more effectively to unlock other pools of capital. Ultimately, it will be about mobilizing the private sector because, again, public capital will remain scarce, so we will not be able to close the gap only with public capital. But that's also not supposed to be, because ultimately we want to show that this is a real business opportunity, as we've seen in the energy sector. So, sorry, a long answer, but I think we're going in the right direction, but we're just not going at the speed that's needed. So I think we're going towards the right direction. We're not yet at the scale, but I think the scale will come, but we're not getting at the speed. And for that, we really need to have some better incentives, better policies that can enable these changes, but also really kind of clear, a fresh look at how the different actors in the financial ecosystem actually are, what they're doing with their resources, and how we can incentivize them to really take into account the co-benefits, but also the externalities of investing. And there again, data and transparency, I think, is a key piece.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. So now I'm trying to open it. I don't know if okay. So Franco Becchio, he says he has which would be the faster policies from a financial perspective to be adopted. I mean, in an extended carbon taxation will work better than any grants. And Severin Racy, he asked to Barbara, do you see a future role for green monetary and macroprudential policy in promoting increases in climate finance? I think that on the first one, maybe on both of them also, Elisa is more than welcome to intervene.
Yeah, and two excellent questions. Franco, to your question, I think you need obviously, different types of policies all working together. There is some very good progress actually that is being made on taxation in the context of international taxation on aviation, on shipping and maritime shipping. So really thinking about how can you quickly come up with some additional revenues for these parts. I think obviously, taxation, if it's implemented well, works well, but at the same time, we will need to continue to use grants for the harder sectors, adaptation, loss and damage, that there are areas where you cannot, just like start, but you can use taxation to then, come up with pools of capital that can be used for the harder sector, the harder geographies. So I think, taxation is part of it. Leveling the playing field. There is a need to finally get rid of subsidies for fossil fuels. We've been talking about that for decades. I think it's time to really kind of get serious about that and make that happen. So I think it's a combination of taxation, of getting rid of detrimental policies, but also using, more innovative sources like blending, like using concessional finance, plus also using, carbon markets, which will continue to actually be a part of a revenue source in the ecosystem. So I think that's on the policy side. On the grid, second question, I think very important. I think this is the monetary and prudential policy in promoting increases in climate finance. There's a much better, I have to say, what I've seen. There's still a lot of silos of discussions at the moment, but there have been more interactions between finance ministries, between different networks in that space, with kind of the core kind of climate finance discussions, which I think is absolutely important. I think it is, I think monetary policy will be key in making sure that the framework is right to kind of shift some of the activities in the space. So I think there is a lot that we can still do to come up with better guidelines and policies also around green budgeting, on disclosure, on standardization across different geographies as well. So I think I certainly see that this is one additional element in the space that will help us create the enabling environments to really incentivize climate investments at scale.
Elisa, do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe very quickly on the point of taxation, which rang a bell, because this was actually very much discussed during the negotiations of the transitional committee, because there's a recognition that the scale of loss and damage financing needs will be such that we can't just rely on public sources. And so there was all the discussion about, they called it innovative sources of funding, and taxation, especially of the aviation sector, was mentioned so many times as a possible revenue stream for the fund. But the problem there is that it's very difficult to link what's happening within the UNFCCC with the outside world in a way, and with international processes happening outside, or even initiatives by the private sector happening outside. So there's what Barbara was already mentioned. There's this need about creating a more coherent and consistent environment to overcome silos and try to make sure that we're leveraging all the resources that we can, instead of creating new funds, new buckets of money that then compete for the available resources.
Okay, maybe you have time for a couple of additional feedbacks and questions. I mean, Franco has another question. What are your feelings on taxonomy and ESG as part of climate finance? What are the expectations from this EU regulation? I just had another question for Elisa. I mean, this COP28 is hosted by the Emirates. I was wondering where these Gulf countries are on this spectrum on the loss and damage debate. So are they on the side of developed countries or on the side of countries asking for reparations and for funds? Any other question, or this might be the final round of comments? Okay, Giorgio Alba, is there any role for climate change litigation considering the ECB and other regulatory burdens, and any comment on the political backfire of green initiatives. We will discuss, maybe this is for Valentina, the backfire of the political backfire of green initiatives, and maybe the final one. I don't try to pronounce correctly this, the name of our friend who is asking, are there any criteria or due diligence checkbox which are documented before funds, the amount of funds, and for what industry conduct policy support for governance will be vital for any respective countries to ensure climate finance is acquired, mobilized, and reported? Wait, this question is too long, but I think you can read it in the chat. So it's up to you to answer. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to get started on the taxonomy question, and probably I will have to drop off after that, but I do want to listen to Elisa and Valentina. But very quick, for me, and for us again at CPI, we have been working very hard on transparency on data and making sure that we get, more standardization and like better data from all types of sources. So I think this is an important one, but I feel what's happening at the moment, and one of our recommendations is that we need to start simplifying and standardizing taxonomies and reporting. There is just like, we call it the wild west of taxonomies and of methodologies and frameworks. I think sometimes that creates more confusion than clarity. There's at least, I think, 30 taxonomies that are being developed or are already existing around the world. And there's more than 200 frameworks, standards, guidelines on sustainability reporting and on climate-related disclosure across, I think it's more than 40 countries now that at least we have been mapped. So we feel there's a real need to harmonize and enhance the interoperability of these tools. And that will really then help to reduce the reporting burdens, the inconsistency, and in this way, I hope make them more useful. And I think there are some initiatives in this space, which are the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, but also a few others. There is the Net Zero Public Data Utility that's being developed. There is the Network for Greening the Financial Systems Data Directory. So I think all of those can be collectively leveraged to really help investors standardize the reporting process, and then really make decision useful data available. And this is, I think, what really is important. I think we need to have data that is useful for decision, that can help inform decisions, and also foster an understanding of how and where to prioritize investments going forward. So not going directly, I think the EU has been instrumental in getting to where we are today, but I feel now it's really time to step back and see how we can make better data based on all the different types of based on kind of better harmonization and standardization to avoid kind of coming further confusing, let's say, some of the investors in this space. And maybe over to Elisa.
Yeah, thanks, Mama. Very quickly on Stefano's question about the role of Gulf countries. Of course, their position, it's a bit slippery in the lesson damage space, because if you look at emissions, for example, Saudi Arabia is not in the top 10, but is scoring 11th in terms of the major emitters, at least for 2 years ago, and these are recent data from WRI. And so, of course, the thoughts this country have is about the possibility to make to be finger pointed as contributors to this kind of fund. So that's why probably they're not always they don't play the most helpful role within negotiations. But for example, the role of the Emirates is very different, because they have the COP presidency this year. So they're really interested in having good results for that. And they've been very proactive in ensuring that the transitional committee was getting to a result. And on the question on the chat, I'm not sure I fully understand it, if maybe it's referring to environmental and social safeguards, but you have my email, so I'm happy to follow up offline. And maybe I will give the floor to Valentina for replying to her question. No, back to you, Stefano, then.
I will just say that we are working now a policy paper reviewing the literature on exactly that topic. And so if you stay tuned, then soon enough, we're going to have a webinar on that very topic. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, Thank you so much. I think this is a perfect conclusion. So I thank you so much, Elisa, Barbara, Valentina, and you all. And just a final reminder, please subscribe to the YEP newsletter so you will stay informed and up to date on everything we do. And when the policy brief Valentina was mentioning will be ready, you will receive a link with the newsletter. And so please subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you so much for this webinar. I think it was very interesting, and maybe we will do a follow-up in the next few months to see what changed after the COP28 meeting. Thank you all. Bye bye.